أعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So today inshallah ta'ala we'll be just continuing discussing the book Kitab As-Salat from the book Al-Bukhari by Zabid rahimahullah ta'ala. And today inshallah ta'ala we'll try to complete this particular chapter as there's just a few hadith that remains. So we'll start discussing the chapter that we had, or what comes after, where we had ended last week. And we discussed last week concerning As-Salat Khalf al-Na'im. So the bab that comes after.
الباب الجديد
أي
هذا الحديث
باب جديد
إذا حمل جارية.
أي إذا حمل جارية
طيب.
صغيرة.
بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. قال مؤلف رحمه الله. Chapter 11. If a small girl is carried on one's neck during as-salat. Hadith number 323, narrated by Abu Qatada Al-Ansari radiyallahu anhu. Allah's Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam was offering the salah and he was carrying Umama, the daughter of Zaynab radiyallahu anha, the daughter of Allah's Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And she was the daughter of Al-As ibn Rabi' bin Abd Shams. When he prostrated, he put her down. When he stood, he carried her on his neck.
So that's the hadith that is mentioned here. So Imam Bukhari, rahimahullah ta'ala, that I've mentioned this bab, as stated here, that in chapter إِذَا حَمْلَ جَارِيَةَ الصَّغِيرَةَ, that carrying a young girl ala unuqi, on one's shoulder fi salat. So this is regarding certain matters, or certain matters relating to the salat. So what is a person allowed or not allowed regarding certain movements in salat, and also in this case carrying a young girl. So he mentioned this hadith regarding this discussion, as stated the hadith of Abi Qatada Al-Ansari radiyallahu anhu, أن رسول الله السلام كان يصلي وهو حامل أمامة. So he mentioned, so from the hadith it shows regarding the Prophet of Islam that in this particular occasion that he was praying and that he was carrying a young girl, and that young child was his granddaughter. So that was his granddaughter Umama bint Zaynab bint Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And also they mentioned her father. So also they mentioned Abi As ibn Rabi' ibn Abd Shams. So that's what they mentioned, but first they mentioned the daughter by way of her mother. And they mentioned regarding concerning of this, that in checking concerning Abi As, that they mentioned that Iman, the Prophet's daughter Zaynab, they got married, and then eventually that at certain points that he was not a Muslim, he accepted Islam later on. So Zaynab married him while before he accepted Islam. And I mentioned regarding concerning that of those who have explained Bukhari, I mentioned that the ruling pertaining to marrying a Muslim woman being married to a non-Muslim man, that came later on in Hudaybiyah. So that came later. So before it was something that would have occurred, but then later on Islam removed a Muslim woman marrying to a non-Muslim man. But I mentioned over regarding Zaynab that she was married to Abi As, and then eventually that she left him and went back to the Prophet ﷺ. Then eventually he accepted Islam. They mentioned that Al-Dhahabi, that when he eventually accepted Islam, that they went back together without per se them remarrying again. So she was a Muslimah, he was not. They were separated for a while. Then eventually that he accepted Islam, and they just continue with their marriage without both of them remarrying again, as their marriage still stand that they had before in Islam. So with this they mentioned that, as for the hadith, they mentioned that mention his name, and others mentioned that she was referred to as Umama bint Zaynab, as at that point, at some point, that her father, he became Muslim later. So at times the daughter will be somewhat lineage will go back to the mother based upon the father accepted Islam later. But overall, that, and also as a form of, they mentioned here, a form of asharf, as a form of, because of its being from the family, the Prophet al-Islam family, as a way of showing honor to the family, they mentioned her with her his granddaughter with the mother, and that lineage, because of the Prophet Islam lineage that supersedes all. But overall discussed concerning the hadith here is that they mentioned that the Shahid mentioned that Hamil, that the Prophet Islam, that he carried Umama on his shoulders, and they mentioned that فَإِذَا سَجَدَ وَضَعَهَا وَإِذَا قَامَ حَمَلَهَا, that whenever he would go in sujood, and also ruku. So whenever he's in sujood, as some narration mentioned, that whenever he's in sujood or ruku, he will put her down. And whenever he goes into qiyam, then he will put her back on his shoulders and carry her. So from this hadith that ulama have mentioned, it shows one, the permissibility of this. So one, it shows the permissibility for a person to carry a young girl while they are in salat. So even the child, as we said, that so as long as that the najasa on the child does not get onto the person. So as long as the najasa does not get onto the person, clothing or the likes, then the person's salat, it is valid, and there is no harm in this. So this hadith is proof of this matter regarding carrying a young child in salah, that is permissible. The Prophet ﷺ did that. He mentioned that Fakihani, one of the ulama named Fakihani, that he mentioned that that the reason behind this particular case with the Prophet ﷺ that carried Umama, his grandchild, in the salat, that I mentioned that there was a somewhat, that is kind of somewhat to undo certain type of idea that the Arabs had then, that regarding concern, they were they keep themselves a distance away from girls. So kind of somewhat they have this superstition, or they have these ideas about girls, so they kind of somewhat they disliked and avoid too much attention and carrying of young girls, even from the family members, and also even carrying them. So that close relation with a young girl, that they kind of somewhat they would avoid those things. So the Prophet Islam in this case, and more so in salat, kind of somewhat to remove that type of idea, that even more so in the salat, that he carried her while he was in the salat. So as to dispel and to remove those type of false ideas that people had during that time regarding how one should interact with a young child. Then also they mentioned regarding concerning from this hadith, that as the ahkam that can be taken from the hadith, that of the ulama who mentioned that from this particular hadith, that it shows that the permissibility to carry whether a young boy or a young girl in salat, it is allowed. So for the person to carry a young boy or a young girl in salat, where it is done by a male, the father or the mother, carrying a young baby boy or young baby girl, then this is something that is allowed in the salat. This is something which is allowed. They mentioned regarding concerns on this matter, that of the ulama who say it is permissible, it is allowed to do so, that they don't make a distinction. They said it is allowed to do so, whether it is the compulsory salat or the nafila salah. So one can carry a child, a baby, in the salat, whether salat is a compulsory salat or is a voluntary salat, it is allowed. And also they mentioned that this can be done by way of the imam. So if the imam leading others, as the Prophet ﷺ in this case was carried a child, so being the imam, the person praying by himself, or the wife praying by her, the mother praying by herself, can carry a child in the salat, and also the person is the ma'moon, and also the person praying behind. So the person praying by the imam that have a young child with him, and he wish to carry the child, then he can do so. So the person, anyone who's praying the salat, they are allowed to carry the child. That's called said now that from the hadith they mentioned that this hadith is show the permissibility of this without any distinction regarding that whether it's a boy or a girl. And also even this qawl that say it is permissible, they even include that the person can carry hayawana. So for example, the person have a cat. Then the cat, you can carry the cat while in the salah. So as long as they mention of those, as long as that animal is somewhat, it is pure, it's clean. So for them, you can carry things in the salah. That would include, now the person might have a bag on his back, or he can carry. So carrying of these things in the salat can be done. So things were said that things have a like human beings and animals are of those things that can be done in the salat. So that's the call of the ulama. Then after the ulama will take another view, and that's the view taken by that's the view taken by as I mentioned by now that by the Shafi'iyah. Then also there's another view on this matter, with the view of the Abu Hanifa. So Abu Hanifa, that is positioned this manner regarding concerning that, as mentioned by some, that with the Ahnaf, they mention that it's permissible, but for them is they take into consider regarding the person doing too much action in the salat, or so that becomes now the issue for them. Is the person making too much movements while in the salat? Then that's when they make the distinction. It's permissible, but without doing too much movements in the salah. Then they between themselves discuss concerning what is said to be too much activity in the salah. Amongst them, the Ahnaf, as to what is said to be too much activity in the salat. So for them, the kind of somewhat of those who mention, as Sahib al-Badi'a, that they mention regarding that, what is said to be too much action, if the person, anything that you have to do with your hand. So anything you have to do with your hand, then I consider that the person will be involved in doing too much in salah. So they mention examples, and if any other than this they mention, then that is somewhat yasir, that is somewhat not that much activity in the salah, or movements in the salat. They mention what is said to be kathir, lots of movement in the salat, and what is said to be qaleel, and what is just a few movements in salat. So they kind of somewhat they mention regarding concern, said that they mention that if the person doing things with his hand, then that may constitute for them, you're doing too much. If it's without your hand, then you're okay. Then I mention an example. They mention, for example, if a woman, or they mention that, if a man was to get a bow, to pick up a bow and to, then that's too much. So the person will take up a chair and to move it, then that would be because it's both hands, that's too much. Because it's done with the hands. So they mention that even if that's so, that's concerning with of them. So they mention, for example, they give an example regarding that, if a woman was to take up the child and then to breastfeed her, that's too much action. But that's a bit, some say but if she was just a carrier and put her on that, then they say that's not enough. But that's how they kind of somewhat make that distinction. So they kind of make a distinction regarding what is said to be kathir al-amal and yasir al-amal in the salat. So they take it from that approach. With me? So don't see it as so it's not per se caring of the child, is how much action is involved. That's the Ahnaf. Then of those who mentioned that they make a distinction between that is allowed to carry a child in the salat, in the nafila, not in the compulsory. So those who make a distinction regarding that you can carry a child in the salah, but they make a distinction that it is not to be done in the compulsory salat, and also, but it is allowed in the not allowed in the compulsory. It's not allowed in the compulsory, but allowed in the voluntary. That's the. So they mentioned that of some of the ulama of the Malikiyah, they kind of somewhat take that route. So Imam Malik and of the Malikiyah who take that route, they make a distinction from compulsory and voluntary salah. But I mentioned that the next one. So before we go to the next one, so that's the view that they take. But I said this particular hadith, that in other narration Abu Dawood of the hadith, it mentioned the salat that the Prophet ﷺ prayed was dhuhr or asr. So the Rawi, they were discussing, so for them it was a compulsory salat. Then the doubt was whether it was a dhuhr or asr salat when this incident occurred. And there's a qawl that said that it was fajr salat. But they said that the hadith regarding fajr salat, that the hadith is mursal, is a weak hadith. So the hadith, so regarding this particular incident, that from the hadith in Abu Dawood, that it mentioned the salat was dhuhr or asr, that hadith is sahih. And for the one that said it was salatul fajr, then that hadith is mutakallam fi. There's some discussion regarding that particular hadith. So from this, for those who make that distinction regarding you're not allowed to do so in the compulsory salat, the hadith is against them. The hadith is against them. And I mentioned also, some narration mentioned yu'amna nas, the Prophet ﷺ, that he was leading the people. So if you're leading the people, then most likely is the compulsory salah. And I mentioned the Prophet ﷺ considered most of his salawat that he would perform, that in the masjid normally be compulsory, and in his home will do the nafila. So overall I mentioned that even some of the ulama, they mentioned that even Al-Qurtubi, so they mentioned that as so said that Imam Malik made a distinction between it is not allowed in the compulsory to carry a child or two, but it is allowed in the nafila. That you find that even from the ulama of the Malikiyah who refute Malik, who rejected the view of Malik. And they mention, which is sometimes that you want to refute one of the imam of that madhab to get someone from their madhab. And also kind of somewhat to refute or counteract a view of an alim, get another alim, one their level or one who's highly respected. So they mentioned that Al-Qurtubi and also Al-Maziri wa Qadi Iyad, that all of those have explanation of Sahih Muslim from the ulama of the Malikiyah. So Al-Qurtubi, also Al-Maziri, and also Qadi Iyad, they kind of somewhat refute the view of Imam Malik. They don't accept the view of Imam Malik regarding the distinction between compulsory and non-compulsory salat. An-Nawawi, who was more of Shafi, that was even more severe. And that view can somewhat facet. So he mentioned that view that is somewhat facet, unacceptable view completely. But that claim also among some of the Malikiyah, that who mentioned that state, some of the Malikiyah, that this particular incident that mentioned the Prophet ﷺ carried the child in the salat, that's mansukh. That practice, it is abrogated. Means it did occur, but then the ruling was removed. We are not allowed to do too much movements in salah. Enough is salat shughul. That so I mentioned that one should not per se that involve too much in extra acts in salat. So they mentioned this particular hadith that this is considered to be mansukh, but then was removed, so it's abrogated. That's a view taken by some of the Malikiyah. Another view that some of the Malikiyah that they mention that this particular hadith regarding this incident is something which is khas for the Prophet ﷺ, something only that was meant for the Prophet ﷺ, no one else. So after those things they said, after this khasa'is, things that are specific and only for the Prophet ﷺ, they mentioned that this was of one of those things, that only he alone, the Prophet ﷺ, is allowed to carry someone, a child, while he's in salah, but no one else. So this is min khasa'isihi, this of those things which is particularly, but the ulama, they refute that view. And so it's not that this ruling, it showed the permissibility to the Prophet ﷺ, that it was to clarify the permissibility to carry a child in the salah. And also that ruling, it remained until Yawm al-Qiyamah. It remained until Yawm al-Qiyamah. So they mentioned that. So the Prophet ﷺ wanted to prove that, or to show, to demonstrate that this is something which is allowed. So that's concerned the ahkam that relates to carrying a child in salah. Now, then they discuss concerning that as for the general benefit of the hadith, it shows, as we said before, that the permissible carrying a child in the salat, whether male or female child. Also from this, it shows the Prophet ﷺ concerned, it shows the character of the Prophet ﷺ, that Umama being from his he said grandchildren, that she came to the masjid and he kind of somewhat elder, as she was also very beloved to him, so he had very great love towards her, so she was there, so he took her while he was in salat. So this shows concern as that the Prophet ﷺ, and of his character, that he was a person who was very loving towards his family members, and also he expressed this, that in the case that even the salat, he will carry the child. And also it shows concern that is rahma wa shafaqa walid, that also that he was a gentle person. Now, where the child came in the masjid, and a girl, and he took her, so it shows that type of gentleness towards children and to others. And also it shows concern the Prophet ﷺ mentioned is tawadu, his level of humility. His level of humility, that that carrying of a child in the salat, and also that allow the child to go on his shoulders while in the salat, and when he went down, he would take her down, put her down close to him, and in sujood, when he got back up, he would take her and she would go back on his shoulders. And this, they said, it occurs repeatedly in all the rak'ah. Now, so it shows that this excessive, you understand that, so it shows is a repeated act that was done throughout the salat. He would allow her to be on his shoulders. So it's something that he did knowingly, and accepted her to do of this, or to get onto his shoulder while he's in the salat. Show the permissibility of this particular act, that he did it intentionally, because it was a repeated act throughout the salat. So they show the Prophet ﷺ concerning his character. And also it shows regarding that of actions that are allowed in the salah, even Salatul Jama'ah, even by way of the imam. Now, so the imam or the person praying by himself, that or the ma'moon, the person that he may at times make that is allowed for them to do certain things while in the salah. So certain movements in salat, it shows that it is permissible with a person, imam, the munfarid or the ma'moon, that is allowed for all to kind of somewhat do certain movements in salat. So that's concerning of those regarding concern A. So that's concerning of this particular hadith. You have discussion regarding that her father, what's his name, that I mentioned, Al-As, what's his name? A discussion between the ulama that mentioned Akthar, a majority of the ulama mentioned that his name is Laqit. So his name is Laqit, according to majority of the ulama. But overall, those are the benefit that relates to this particular salat. So it shows regarding the permissibility of carrying a child in the salah, and this does not nullify the person's salat. So that's concerning of those masahid that relates to this particular hadith. Aywa.
قال المؤلف رحمه الله. Chapter 12. A woman can remove troublesome or offensive things from a person in the salah. Hadith number 324. Hadith of Ibn Mas'ud about Prophet's invocation against Quraysh on the day when they put abdominal contents. Ibn Mas'ud said, their bodies were dragged and thrown in al-qalib. Well, and the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, Allah's curse has descended upon the people of Al-Qalib.
Before we go to that hadith, also they mentioned that there's a book that partly in print, but to be printed. It's another explanation of Sahih Bukhari. It's another explanation of Sahih Bukhari, that online, that you have a particular website, that they dedicate that website, which is like a muassis, like a institute, that have researchers and all that, and they dedicate themselves to Sahih Bukhari. So anything that relates to Sahih Bukhari, they're on it. That's their area of specialization and what they focus on. So they have a book that I mentioned that Bukhari, like Sahih Bukhari, the actual the book itself. Then they have like Muqtasarat, that those who have we call it Muqtasarat, like this one, summaries. Then you have books that are Al-Jam Bain Bukhari and Muslim. Then you have explanations. Then you have books that relate just to Bukhari as a tarjum of Imam Bukhari. That also you have books that relate just to the Rijal of Sahih Bukhari. Many things, so anything that relates to Bukhari, that's their focus. So of those books that is in print, but the print is in print, but also they have a print of the book, and that book is called Najah al-Qari, li Sahih Bukhari. So the explanation, but this one online, it's 30 volume. This one online is 30 volume. So most of them say, so after note that he mentioned regarding this particular one, I've seen it in print, but is to see a proper print. It is in print, but from like a printing house that you have to be careful of. You only buy stuff from them if there's nothing else available and you need that thing. You have certain printing house, they are like that. You only buy stuff from them if you need that book, and they're the only one who have printed that book. Because normally books have a lot of errors. So if you buy their book, know that in the future you may have to buy it again. So one of those sorts of printing houses, they are known that if you buy their stuff, it was said because you need it. But if you buy it, know that you may have to re-buy it again in the future. So overall, with this particular hadith, he mentioned that he mentioned regarding concerning of that I mentioned that with all the ulama, they mentioned regarding the person, regarding that in carrying a child, it doesn't nullify the person's salat, and you do not need to repeat your salat. Just think to add to the hadith that we just mentioned before. So in carrying a child, then it doesn't nullify the person's salat, nor the person need to repeat his salah. Then also they mentioned, as we said regarding the Prophet Islam concerning his character, then also they mentioned that of the point of the hadith regarding concerning it showed the permissibility of children being allowed inside the masjid. So from the hadith that it showed the permissibility or the allowance for children to come into the masjid. I would say in this case the Prophet ﷺ was praying and the child entered. So they mentioned that so that is something which is allowed, that a child entering of the masjid, Then also they mentioned that even concerning the Prophet Islam, that during the salat, that he had to touch the child. So touching a child, which is said this time as a jariyah, a young girl. So I mentioned before of those things that nullify the salat. That that touching a child, a child, or even touching a woman in the salat, it doesn't nullify your salah. That's called raja. So touching a woman, they said in this case, was a young girl. So carrying her does not nullify your salat by touching a child, or for a person who was to touch a woman in the salat. You're in the salat and you touch a woman, or she touch you, as we're discussing, that it doesn't nullify your salah. So it's not ulama take the position to know that touching a woman nullify your salah. But qawl raja, the more correct view, that's not the case. That's not the case. Then to the hadith that was just mentioned. So quickly regarding concerning hadith, it was mentioned that the author rahimahullah ta'ala, that he mentioned is a portion of the hadith, a juz of the hadith. So this hadith is much lengthy hadith in Sahih Bukhari, but he mentioned a portion of the hadith. With this hadith concerned that the hadith that it mentioned regarding the Prophet Islam was praying in the Kaaba, and that while he was praying, that the Quraysh were there sitting around, that kind of somewhat they kind of that and the idea that to get some of their young boys, some people to kind of somewhat gather these things into blood, intestines, and to put it on the Prophet Islam while he was praying. So they said when he's going to sujood, then he does like creep upon him, slowly go upon him, go upon him, and put these things on him while he's in sujood. And they did. So they said to know that the worst amongst them, they went and they carried out. Then when the Prophet Islam was in salat and he was still continuing, so he had things on him that of things of filth. So he had things on him of things of filth. Then I mentioned that Al-Fatima, anha, that she came and she kinda took it off her father and took it off the Prophet ﷺ, or Fatima came and removed from the Prophet ﷺ. So they mentioned that Surah Hadith is regarding concern that that and then the Prophet ﷺ, then when she took it and she kinda saw she cursed them. Now because they were still there, laughing at what they were doing. That so when she came, she removed the thing from the Prophet ﷺ while he was in salah. So they mentioned that it shows regarding concern that a marha, which is Fatima, while the Prophet ﷺ was in salah, that he had things on him, that things are felt, and she came and she removed it. So I mentioned that with that, it showed that that as we discussed, that remove the person have felt on them in the salat, and those things and they are removed, it does not nullify his salah. But there's some tafsir, there's some more details that goes with it. But so that's concerning this particular hadith. So the Prophet ﷺ, when they did this and after the salat, he kind of he cursed them. The people who were behind this, like I said, some of the heads of Quraysh, they were behind it. Then the Prophet ﷺ, he cursed them. And then eventually they all died. Soon after, they all died. And they were kind of somewhat thrown into, they were dragged in the battle and thrown into this well. So they mentioned regarding concerning this particular hadith is regarding concerning that they mentioned from the hadith that the hadith is discussed regarding that the shahid from the hadith that if there's things of felt on a person that it fall into different so they mentioned that if there's felt upon a person, what's the hukum? If there's felt upon a person in salat, what is the hukum regarding that person's salat? With me? So they mentioned that the Sahaba that it was of those cases. They mentioned that if it's just as the filth is a small amount, very small, then the person is excused. So the general rule is that for the salat, that a person have to be pure regarding concerning that the place that he's praying, his clothing, and he also is in a state of tahara. So the person who so that was a condition of salah. So that's a condition, one of the condition of salat, that a person and the things around him regarding that should be pure, in a state of tahara. That meaning his body, himself in a state of, and his clothing, and the place that he's praying should be pure. But in this case, if filth was to get onto his clothing, then what to be done in that case? So they mentioned that either was said to know one, the amount of filth is a very small amount, then he's excused. It's a very small amount, then he's excused. But then you have the case now of a sizable amount of filth is onto the person, then what's the condition of his salat? They mentioned regarding concerning one, if the person that is unaware that there's filth on him. He has filth, but he who's praying is unaware. This is during salah. Now, then they mention that if he's unaware and then he become aware, he was unaware, but then he becomes aware of this filth on his clothing or his shoes or whatever, that if he's in the salat, then it becomes compulsory upon him to remove it and not to continue. So if he's aware that his filth is there, and then he should remove that filth, and if he continue, then his salat is invalid because he's aware. As for example, and the Prophet that he prayed he prayed in the masjid with others behind, and then Jibreel alayhi salam came to him and told him that he has filth on his shoe. Now, and he was already part way in the salat. So he removed it. Everyone else followed, but even though they didn't have filth on their shoe, but everyone else followed. So the Prophet ﷺ removed his shoes while he was in the salat, and he completed the salat and did not repeat it. So, but for a portion of the salat, he had filth on his shoe. But he was what? He wasn't aware. But when he became aware, he removed it. So the person who becomes aware, then he removes it. If he says, so for example, the person, let's mention, for example, they mentioned the person wearing a thobe. The person wearing a thobe. Now, which is, and he's now become aware that there's filth on it. Then he takes off his thobe. Now, you said you're shaking your head? Now, that because in most cases, it's very understand that you wear your t-shirt underneath, isn't it? And you have pants under. So if you take off your shoes, you maybe, you understand, for example, the person have a jacket, and the filth is on his jacket, then he can drop the jacket, can take off the jacket. With thobe on, you have to know what you're wearing. So the person wearing a thobe, then he has to know what he's wearing, said, underneath, or clothing. Alhamdulillah. So in continuing, so that case regarding the person then becomes aware, then he should, then and if he continues, then I mentioned that the person's salat becomes invalid. So the person become aware and did not remove that thing, then his salat becomes invalid because he has gone against concerning of those commands regarding that he should pray his salat in a state of tahara, and he forfeit that condition. So it becomes sort of for the person to remove himself from the salat and remove that filth, and then for the person to repeat his salah. Then I mentioned that the next case that they mentioned that the person that he has najasa on him that he is unaware of. He's ignorant, he's unaware concerning that, but he has completed salah. Then after completing salah, then it is brought to his attention. So the person had najasa on him, he was unaware of it, but and he completed his salat, and at the end, then he becomes aware of this. So what's the case regarding such a person? So is the salat valid or not? Then with that matter, you have a discussion between the ulama. So you have three aqwal. So this case regarding the person have najasa on him or her, the musalli, and the person, but he's ignorant of it. And then his salat, he has completed his salat. Then at the end, he becomes aware of this. What becomes now the ruling regarding that case? Of those aqwal mentioned, la tusi salat. that a person's salat is considered to be, that his salat is la tufsid, that his salat is not considered to be invalid. That his salat is still considered to be valid. And of those who take this view, Ibn Umar, Ata, Sa'id ibn Musayyib, also Ibn Taymiyyah is more inclined towards that view, and a riwayah and Ahmed and Shafi, that a person in that state that the salat is la tufsid salatu, that his salat is not considered to be invalid. The next view that on this mentioned that the person is yu'id as-salah, that a person have to repeat his salah. So the person at the end, even though he was not aware, but he ended salat with najasa. So they said with this, the person have to repeat his salat. And that's the call of those concerned, Shafi'i, of that view, it is the more correct view upon Shafi'i, a position taken by Ahmed. So they mentioned that the person have to repeat his salat, and salat is invalid because he has forfeit one of the condition of the salat, which is tahara. So he has forfeit one of the condition of salat, which is tahara. So based upon this, the person's salat is invalid whether the person was aware of it or unaware of it. So they said that take the same thing again, the person who prayed and is without wudu. You make a salat and you prayed without wudu, then the person's salat is not valid. So they said that fall into that category because it's one of the conditions of salat. So if it is the person whether is ignorant or not, it is the salat in such that salat, it is not valid. As for the third opinion that they mentioned regarding that qawl of Imam Malik or Rabi', that they mentioned that the person who repeats his salat, but they mentioned that if it's within that salat is still within the time of salat. But if the time of pass, then no. So for example, the person prayed dhuhr, and dhuhr ends at 5 o'clock, and he prayed dhuhr, then become aware that he prayed salat with najas upon him, and he become aware of that at 4 o'clock. They mentioned you have to repeat your salat. But if the person come aware of it after 5, 6 o'clock, then no. And that's the qawla taken by Shafi and Rabi'a. So that's concerning aqwal of the ulama on this matter. Allahu a'lam, that qawl awwal aqwa. Qawl awwal aqwa, that a person's salat is not considered to be invalid if he was not aware, even though he has completed salat. With that, inshallah, I will end. Wabillahi ta'ala tawfiq.